am Vero, and this is Modern Immigrant. Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of Modern Immigrant. I'm so happy that you're here on another week exploring an immigration journey. Remember to check out our Instagram at Modern Immigrant and our website, modernimmigrant.net, where you can find our merch that we sell to support immigrant causes, and you can find our book club and other things that we're doing over there. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on the platform that you're listening to this episode. Have you ever felt like you don't have a home, and I'm quoting home, where to go to? Have you ever experienced that feeling of having like multiple places where you can go and where you technically belong, but you don't really feel that you're from there? Veena is today here with us. Veena shared with us about her multiple immigrations, about being born in the US, moving to Canada, to India, living in England, and currently in Costa Rica. She has also lived in multiple other countries and continents that she's going to share with us in this interview. This interview was truly beautiful and inspiring to me. Veena talked about the importance of our parents' immigration journey and how that impacts our own journeys and the decisions that we make later in life. Something that truly inspired me about this conversation, and I think it's going to inspire you as well, or I hope that it will, is the concept of immigrant privilege and the privilege that we carry as immigrants in many cases, especially when we choose where we want to move, where we want to migrate, and when we have like that ability to make that choice for ourselves. I think it's truly important that you listen to this interview and you realize and start to identify your own privilege as an immigrant. I think that's going to help us build community, build empathy, compassion towards one another. And also it's going to help us like learn how are we going to respect other immigrants, other cultures, and other people around the world. In this episode, we talk about how much immigration will change us and how much our perspectives are going to shift and how beautiful that can be and what can we learn from that. I hope you enjoyed this interview. Veena talked about her book, and I'm also going to leave a link down below so you can find the book. So thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to check the links down below so you can connect and learn more about what we talked during this interview. Remember to share with someone if you found it helpful. And yes, thank you for being here. Enjoy it. Your name is Veena, or am I pronouncing it right?
It's Veena, and in Costa Rica, everybody says Veena because it's written for English speakers. But my name in Indian culture, names are very important, and my name is the name of the instrument my grandmother played, which is it's like a Siddharth, but it's bigger. It's from South India. But there's an interesting story about my name because I was born in the US in the early 1960s before immigrants outside Europe were really allowed in the US. So there was nobody like me. And my father had all these ideas for different names. And my grandmother wrote him a letter. I still have the aerogram. And she said, this child is going to grow up in the US and Americans can't say our names. She needs to have a name with meaning, but it also has to be something people can say. So she named me. So
that's beautiful.
The Veena is played by the goddess of creativity and music and education. So that was also the double meaning of it. And I carry that with me. I carry my abuelita with me on that.
That is so beautiful. The importance of your name and the story of your names is so pretty. Thank you for starting with that, Veena. And let me welcome you to Modern Immigrant. Veena, I'm really excited to have you here. I'm excited and I can't wait to explore your immigration with you. So thank you for being here.
And thank you for having this podcast. I've been listening to the range of stories you cover, and I'm so in awe of what you've been doing and how you're expanding how we look at immigration and immigrants.
Thank you. And I think then you're probably familiar with our first kind of question that I always ask, which is, when did your immigration journey start? And I know in the email you sent me to connect, you said that your immigration story was unusual. I would love to hear, why do you call your immigration unusual? And tell us a little bit more of how that started.
Well, I'm an immigrant. My immigration story is unusual because I have never belonged to any place. If you look at me, you might think I'm from India and I immigrated to the US, but actually my parents met in the US before Indians were allowed to emigrate. And after they had me in the US, they had to leave almost immediately because they weren't permitted before 1965. Anyone outside Europe, it was almost impossible to immigrate to the US. So we went to Canada, but it was also difficult to immigrate to Canada. So when I was 6, my first immigration that I remember is of being a little Canadian kid immigrating to India. And when I was 6 and we emigrated to India, people like me didn't exist. People who looked Indian but didn't know any Indian language, watched American TV shows, didn't understand where I was going. We lived in 3 different cities in India because India didn't recognize my parents' American qualifications as doctors, so they had to start over. So we emigrated to cities where the second language was always different that I had to learn in school. And by the time we got to Delhi, I had to learn Hindi, but I didn't speak it at home. But I had to learn it because everyone else was a native speaker. So in my mind, I wanted to go home. And for me, home was the US. I knew I was from the US because I was born there. So my parents, under the change of the laws, they applied to go to the US. And when I was almost 9, we landed in New York. So I am an immigrant to the country of my birth. And I thought, in my 9-year-old self, I thought, great, I'm finally home. But of course, nobody else saw me as American. At the time, the place that we moved to in Queens is now one of the most diverse parts of the world. There are over 100 languages in the area that we used to live. But at the time, immigrants still weren't coming in. So my school in Queens had 2 African-American kids and me. Everyone else was white. So it was quite exclusionary. And I think my story is unusual because it was a shock for me, because I had gone through nothing quite as extreme in India, but in India, I was always reminded of being an outsider. I was always the American kid who didn't understand things. So I thought, I'm going home. But it turned out America in the 70s was not the place it is now. And I learned about this, Vero, in this book called The Other 1%. I don't know if you can see it.
I don't see it, but I'm going to add it on the episode
This book
description.
is about the history of Indian immigration to the US, but it actually could be any non-white immigration, in that it shows that, there's a stereotype that Indians in the US are among the highest earning, very educated, every Indian's a doctor, but that's not really about being Indian. That's about the kind of selection process that the US had to let people in. So logically, if you're from Central America, where more of a range of people can get to the US because it's very closer. There's going to be more of a range of people. There's going to be the doctor, but there's also going to be the agricultural worker. The agricultural worker from India is not going to get to the US. They're going to go somewhere else. So I think that what this book helped me to understand is how unusual my parents were. My mother arrived in Brooklyn at 23 in 1959 to work in a hospital. She wasn't married. And that was unusual for American women, actually. And one of the things she says now is how shocking it was for her to see how few American women were in the workplace. And how in her medical school in India, a third of the class was female. Because it was just different. The stratification was different. Like in Latin America, sometimes class is more important than gender.
And I know that's something that we're going to explore, because it's so amazing what you're sharing with us and just giving us your perspective of immigration. What I'm hearing is that there's a huge impact when there's lack of representation, where there's lack of, not seeing someone that looks like you or that does things that you're doing or in your position. And it seems like your parents experienced that. And then I want to ask you, how did that impact you? Like growing up in the US, in your home, and I'm quoting home because of what you're kind of explaining. how do you think that impacted who you are today?
Tremendously, to the extent that I've immigrated out of the US twice. I'm in my second immigration out of the US in Costa Rica. But growing up in Long Island, I've learned recently after the Buffalo Massacre, there was an article that quoted the Brookings Institute in Washington has data showing that Long Island, where I went to high school, is still one of the most segregated parts of the country. And when I went to school in Long Island, we lived in a white area. And my high school had 2,000 students. And when I was a senior, the Black population doubled from 2 to 4. And people complained. People complained. And that was it. It was extremely segregated. And I was excluded. But I'm not trying to in any way equate my experience with what it would have been like to be African American. But only to say that I remember feeling really alienated. And then in university, it wasn't quite like that. But I had incidents when I was in university where I had a class once in graduate school where you were graded based on how much you talked in class. And I was always raising my hand, but I could never get called on. And I was really, after 6 weeks of sitting in the middle of the class and waving my arms, I got really fed up and I went to talk to the professor. And I knocked on the door and I sat down. And before I could open my mouth, he said, "It must be so hard for you coming from your culture when you're not used to speaking." And I just erupted. And I said, "You have no idea how much I'm trying to speak. You just don't see me." And to his credit, he was contrite and he apologized. But it had never occurred to me that somebody would look at me that way.
And assume that immediately.
Yeah, because
right?
there was nobody like me. There was nobody like me.
Right.
And of course, now in the US, there's so many people like me. And I think that I'm not really used to that because I've been shaped by a time when I was always the only one. So I always had to and also when I was growing up and coming of age, if you were Indian American, you became a doctor, because my parents' generation had very few options and there were just a few things you could do to have a steady job. But that's not what I wanted to do. And I wasn't good at science anyway. I wouldn't have gotten in. So that created a lot of stress and tension with my family because nobody had done what I wanted to do. I wanted to join the Peace Corps. I wanted to work on poverty in Latin America and Africa. And my father used to say to me, "You're just never going to have a job. You're never going to be employed," because it was something that was outside what they thought they were being immigrants for. They were being immigrants to help me.
Right. And I think many times immigrants, for example, you're saying like your parents wanted that specific job for you. And I think like it's because those are the jobs that sometimes give you that success when you're an immigrant, right? Because you are like giving the country something that they need, right? Like we always have like that weight that we carry as immigrants, that you need to be an immigrant and work on something that's gonna add on the economy, right? Which is like, well, what if I'm not good at that, right?
But it's also to add on the personal story, so it makes the sacrifice worth it. Because even though my parents were doctors, because they had to keep moving and starting over, they never really had much money. So they had the status of being doctors, but always like they thought like working class people in terms of how they saved money. And I think that was a very good thing because it made me feel like, I can study and I can do. I definitely inherited privilege from that, from the fact that they were doctors, rather than agricultural workers meant that I didn't have college debt. There may be people much smarter than me whose parents didn't have that kind of expectation. 100%. So I definitely have a complicated story that's a mix of privilege and being othered. And I was very drawn to your podcast because you're a Latina. And in Latin America, I have seen how unusual someone like me is. People are used to North Americans being gringa, being white. And in Costa Rica, being Indian is quite unusual. And also speaking Spanish is unusual. So I'm privileged in a different way. I'm sort of exoticized. People think that like people will wear, like the yoga instructor will wear a t-shirt that has Sanskrit on it. And I'll say, do you know what that means? Ah, no sé, no sé. And I said, maybe you should know what it means, because I find my culture is a bit fetishized here, but in a way that makes everything great. And not realizing that in India, there's tremendous prejudice right now. There's a lot of intolerance of Muslim populations, of people who aren't perceived as being religious enough in a very doctrinaire way. But I get to carve my own space here because there's no preconceptions about me. So that's very interesting.
It is interesting, though, what you're saying. I think is very unique because we hope that people will receive us, right? And that people would accept how we are. But we also, I think it's also so important that they understand where we come from, right? Because you're saying that it's just kind of like, oh yeah, so amazing, right? Like India, the culture, we're gonna like use it in a really positive way. But it's like, wait a second. It's not just that. Like it's like another extreme, right? Because here, sometimes in the US, I have experienced like the opposite, right? Like people assuming that because I'm a Latina, then that means this and this and that, or they immediately think less of you. But how interesting that you have experienced the opposite and felt a little like, that's not quite right.
Yeah, most of the time, Vero, I glide with it and I benefit from it. So most of the time, you know, even the taxista who thinks that Nicaraguenses are terrible and they are, even though they do all the difficult work in Costa Rica, they shouldn't be let in. That person will look at me in a different way because I am a privileged immigrant. And I recognize that. And that's why when I go to the US and I see this umbrella category of BIPOC, you know, bi, person of color, indigenous, I'm troubled by it because I feel it reduces and simplifies the different hardships different groups have had. Because some of us who are immigrants, whose families were immigrants to the US, have brought privilege with us. Even though I look like a small, dark woman when I'm in the US, and even though I have had many experiences where I experience othering and discrimination, it's not the same as other people. And I feel that's something as an American who is not living in the US, I don't really know how to navigate. And it's the same, it must be same for people from Latin America, because somebody who is educated from Venezuela, you know, Mexico, wherever, is different from the Mayan woman from Guatemala who's struggling to survive and whose crops aren't growing because of climate change. But it all gets reduced. And so sometimes we can glide and benefit from it. But I feel I push South Asian Americans, I push a lot of people I know to be more honest about the privileges we have and not to simply group ourselves within others.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you're saying that, because I feel like that was a huge inspiration for me to start this podcast, was to show the differences within the immigrant community, which is huge. And it's funny because I sometimes get people asking things about, you know, am I an immigrant? Do I fit in the category? And I'm like, right, like I'm trying to make this concept be broader, but people, you know, I feel like we have the need to know who's an immigrant and who's not, right? Who belongs to this and who doesn't. Like immediately we're trying to do that. And that happened with the Latino community. It's like, in the white, are you white but you're Latina, but are you this, are you that? And sometimes it can be exhausting to try to always, because we're so different and we're so diverse, right?
Yes, we are. But I think when I meet someone else whose parents were immigrants, I do feel a kinship. I feel there's a sense of understanding what it's like to have your parents not sound like the other parents. And ironically, you know, my children have that experience. They grew up in London, and I was the parent who didn't have an English accent. And now we're in Costa Rica, and I'm the one who's different. So I understand, you know, I'm repeating this cycle.
Yes.
And I'm trying to give them what I benefited from, which is a broader perspective on the world, and a broader perspective than seeing it's just India and the US, because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal. And in Nepal, there were many people who were very resentful of India and Indians because India is the superpower that's next door.
Right.
So when people liked me, they would say, Nepali chaste dekinsha, which means you're just like a Nepali. And when they didn't like me, they'd say, you're like an Indian. So it trained me that our perceptions of people are really fluid. And we're not just one thing. We're kind of floating through. And it's true when I visit Indigenous women here, when I visit people in Nepal, in the village, because I'm small and I'm dark, I'm not threatening. So that's an advantage. When you're with people who don't have power, they don't see you as intimidating. So I've learned over the years that nothing is completely a disadvantage or completely an advantage. And you have to figure out how to steer it.
And I think owning that privilege can be so powerful too. And like recognizing it and identifying that we carry certain privilege. And I think that's going to help us in the journey of not being part of the oppressor either, right? Like if we can identify it. And I want to talk about your book because you were talking about your experience in Nepal. And yes, if you have it, show it to us. And we're going to, oh my goodness. I think put your hand. Yes. Maybe put your hand behind it and we might be able, no.
Our Mothers Ourselves is a project that came during the pandemic, in the worst part of the pandemic in 2020, when, you know, my mother is a widow. She lives in Pennsylvania. You know, she's now 87, and I didn't know when I would see her again. I formed a group with 5 other women in the UK and in Japan, and I've only met 2 of them. And we decided that we would all write about our mothers, and we would write about their journeys. And several of our mothers were immigrants, not all of them were. And so I started calling my mother every day to ask her, how did you end up at 23 getting on? She had never been to the capital. She'd never been outside of South India. And she jumped on a plane that it took 3 days and 7 flights to get to. She ended up working in Crown Heights in Brooklyn. And she had no idea what she was getting into. She just knew America from Hollywood movies. No one in her family had ever been to the US.
Wow.
So I was very curious. Why did you do that? Because most, you know, when you look at Vice President Kamala Harris, her mother was from the same community as my mother. She frames the story in terms of like an American feminist lens. You know, she said, my mother had a very progressive father. She was very independent. She went to Berkeley. There's some truth in that, but there's also something that is very much about caste and family and opportunities that is hard to translate to Americans. So I wanted to tell my mother's story. And what I learned in that story is that immigrants actually have more in common with each other than they do with people from their country. So in some ways, my mother, she lives in a retirement community. In some ways, she has more in common with the German immigrant woman across the hall than she does with an Indian woman in India, because she was willing to leave behind her past, and she was willing to be in the US at a time when you couldn't call, you couldn't visit, you had to write a letter, wait 3 weeks for a reply, 4 weeks. You had to be a different kind of person than today. You had to be kind of a very internally driven person. And you had to be somebody who was willing to have an adventure.
Yes.
And I think that is what immigrants share when they come by choice as opposed to being refugees. we're in the world now, we're going to see people who are fleeing the climate crisis. We're seeing people leaving war. Your country, Venezuela, we're seeing layers and layers of people, different kinds of education, different backgrounds, leaving a state that doesn't function. So that's different, I think.
Yes.
But it still takes a willingness to reinvent yourself.
It still takes that desire. And something that I think you mentioned earlier, and we also talked about it on email, you talk about how your different immigrations, and especially going to Costa Rica, has shaped the way you see how being an American can be. And you talk about class status, not necessarily only race, but how has that been for you? Like, how do you see being an American now?
Oh, it was very confusing in London. Of all the places I've lived in Malawi, Honduras, India, Nepal, Canada. I think the UK, Britain, was the most confusing culturally because I thought I would get what was happening because I speak English and they speak English. But it turns out our languages are culturally shaped. So I'm learning that in Spanish too, that the Spanish they speak in Spain is not the Spanish they speak in Costa Rica. In Costa Rica, they speak in circles. And in Spain, they speak directly. So when I was in London, I assumed that I would fit into the framework the way I do in the US, where I'm seen as an Indian American. But because Asians have been in London so much longer than the US, there really wasn't a sense of me being an outsider in London, and people interpreted my directness as being upper class. So there were several times when I was with a working class white person where they would get angry with me. And I didn't understand why they were angry with me. And later an English friend would explain it's because, number one, they assume you're British because you're Indian. If I had been white with the same accent, they would have thought I was American. But because I'm Indian, they just assumed I was British. Number two, my directness, instead of saying, could you please help me with such and such? That's what I would say as an American. You're supposed to say, I'm terribly sorry to bother you, but I'm afraid I can't find you. You work in a circle. And it's about being polite. And an American would think that was just being fake. But it turns out they do the same thing in Costa Rica. You have to, even if it's an emergency, ¿Cómo estás? Bien, por dicha. ¿Cómo está todo? Because if you don't do that, people think you're aggressiva.
You're rude.
And that's what they think in England. So working class white people thought I was rude. They thought, and I couldn't read the cues. So what I learned is that my demeanor, my coming across like somebody who's educated, came across like someone with class privilege in the UK in a way that it doesn't in the US. Not that there isn't class in the US. There is class, definitely, in the US. But it manifests differently. So I've learned.
And it's less obvious too, because I come from Venezuela, and in Venezuela, everything is about the class that you're at. And you can identify that very quickly by the school that you went to, if you went to private school, but the university that you access, even the area where you live in the city. So it is interesting that when I moved to the US, I felt similarly. It was like, the classes feel more even in a way, like you can find a ton of diversity, but they're not. Exactly. It's very tricky because you live in this neighborhood and you assume that because of where I come from, that everyone has similar class in my neighborhood, and it's really not. From one house to another, it's a different world.
Yes. And the signifiers are different. So what I learned in the UK was what school you went to was a class signifier, but not what university you went to. In the US, what university you go to is more of a class signifier, because if you can say, I went to Princeton, I went to Harvard, even if you're working class, it puts you in a kind of different category. So Barack Obama grew up very modestly. He grew up with a single mom, not much money. But when he first ran for president, he was attacked by Republicans for being elitist because he went to Harvard Law School. And in the UK, Gordon Brown, when he ran for prime minister, he went to Oxford. But because he went to a public school and didn't go to an elite private school, he was seen as working class. Where he went to university didn't matter. So it's the difference between thinking you can remake yourself and coming from the background you come from. But I am struck now when I visit the US how clasista it is. I feel like it's very much that way. But when I learned in England, when I learned the code, when I finally, it took me years and years, after 8 years, I understood that as an American, I was looking at things through race and ethnicity, but actually class was how I needed to look through things. And I was misinterpreting how people were relating to me because I didn't understand that. So in Costa Rica, I often hear from, I have friends who are from Uruguay, Argentina, Venezuela, and they often say to me that they don't understand what people are saying here. And then I say to them, entiendo muy bien, because of my England experience, that it's not about language the way we usually understand it as having to learn. It's about culture and how we place each other.
And that's so interesting because what you're saying brings back to the learnings that you had when talking to your mom and the book that I really want to get. And you're going to tell us where we can get it. But because I think that's why immigrants connect to each other so well. When you're an immigrant and you're in another country, you can talk to people from different countries and in a way come together to this difficulty to navigate the culture, right? Because when I talk to my friends that are from Argentina, that are from Mexico, and we're all like, okay, we don't get this. What's happening, right? What's this thing that I'm missing? Because I wanted to like immediately ask you, like, how can we do that as immigrants? How can we learn those cues? And I do think it takes time, but it also takes that community of other immigrants to be able to talk, and maybe they can share with you what they have learned, which sounds similar to what you have done.
I feel, Vera, what you're describing is my whole life. When I moved to India as a child, nobody thought to tell me what's the right way to eat, what's considered good manners. Everyone assumed I knew it because I'm Indian. So it was only by constantly breaking rules that I figured out the rules. And the same thing happened when I went back to the US. And so now I'm a really careful observer of codes. So in my work, I've worked for Human Rights Watch and I've also worked for the World Bank, Banco Mundial. These are different cultures. The codes are different. So I find that I have to pay attention to how do you bring in a new idea? How do you, one thing you learn when you're anywhere except the US is that you don't come in with what you want to do when you come to a meeting. You make chit chat, sometimes for a long time. In like Nepal, you drink 3 or 4 cups of tea and you never talk about the work, because if you don't establish the relationship, there isn't trust, there isn't confianza. In the US, you might get impatient with that. It might take a while. But actually what I learned living in Washington, I did advocacy work in Washington, is that Washington is a lot like a village. Washington is a very small city, and people know each other and they know each other's backgrounds. And once I understood that Washington operated like a village, I was able to do my work better because I was able to figure out these networks.
Right.
But I remember when I was in Africa, I was in a part of Africa, my first trip, where the Indians there were shopkeepers. And the Africans I worked with were used to having white bosses, but they weren't used to having me as a boss. So they would ask me, a lot of times they would say, Veena, where's your shop? And I'd say, well, I don't have a shop. I'm working for the UN. Or they would tell me without realizing, they would talk to me about how Indians are so greedy. Indians don't mix with people. And sometimes they would say, oh, I forget you're Indian. I like you so much. I forget you're Indian. So
wow,
it was that doesn't happen in Latin America because there's no stereotype. But it doesn't make me think that it couldn't happen. So when I look at what's happening in the US now, and I can see that there's so much extremism, I realize that there's separate spaces for people. They're not used to mixing.
Yeah.
But it was something that I found difficult in Africa, but when I got to know people, I would challenge them. I would say, oh, there's a lot of white Zimbabweans, there's a lot of white Zambians, Malawians. You're not asking them. They don't mix. You're not asking them. And they would laugh and they would say, yeah, you're right. But it made me feel that I represented a lot of different things. And I had to be very sensitive and aware of that.
Yeah. I really love that. And I really love how diverse your experience has been with immigration and how many things you have learned. I feel like I can do tons of different episodes with you exploring like different things. So I really appreciate that. And I want to ask you kind of like as we approach the ending of our conversation, what is the message that you would like to leave to our listeners that are immigrants, that are navigating immigration in different countries, that might be struggling, that might be feeling lost? What's something that have helped you or guide you throughout all those different journeys?
That's such a great question, Vero, because there's this process that happens where you're othered. You feel like you belong, and then you become something else. So when you go back to the country that you're supposed to be from, you're not quite there either. You're in your own space. And I find that I'm definitely in a different space from being American or Indian. Part of me is Costa Rican now. Part of me is British. Part of me is Nepali. But one of the things I've noticed in that process is being very trying to be very peaceful with people's questions. When I'm in the US, I notice something interesting now. People who are older than me, people who are in their 60s, are the ones who are most likely to ask me, where are you really from? I used to get that a lot when I was young, because there were so few immigrants. Americans would always ask me, my classmates in school, but okay, where are you from? And I would say New York, but where are you really from? And it only happens with older Americans now, because I realize I have empathy. They grew up at a time when nobody was different, and they're not used to it. But people in their 20s, they know everyone. So there's a generational shift that mirrors the immigration shift. And so I think one of the things immigrants have now in the US, even if you go to places that didn't used to have immigrants, like the suburbs of Nashville or North Carolina or rural Nebraska, there are immigrants now. And there's a chance to be with your group, and there's a chance to mix, and there's a chance to be able to dispel the stereotypes people have of you. And it's so alarming and upsetting to see what we've seen in the last year with anti-Asian violence, and it's mostly been East Asian. There has been some South Asian, but any kind of violence against any group is against all of us.
100%.
And to see that this idea that we're always getting better about it is not always true, and we have to keep dispelling. So for me, I feel very curious and interested in people from any immigrant background, because I usually have a connection from my work. And when I have to tell you, to end, a funny thing that used to reveal people's assumptions, when I worked for the World Bank, there was a while when I was working on Peru and Colombia. And in the meetings, half the people were Latin American and half were European or American. And we all would speak in Spanish. I was usually the only person who wasn't white as a foreigner. And so people used to say, ¿Cómo aprendiste español? Like it was such a weird thing to speak Spanish. And I'd say, at first I didn't understand. I'd say, en colegio in Nueva York, I learned in high school. It's like, it's the most common language to learn. But of course, the real question was, how can you be Indian and be here? You're supposed to be working on Asia. And I think what they were revealing is that if you're white, you can really go work anywhere. But if you're Latin American, you stay in Latin America. If you're Asian, you stay in Asia, but you're not as versatile. So I see my role as trying to change that. I hope that, Venezuelans are working in Nepal, and, Chinese are working in different places. So I think that there's a hunger for that.
And that more people speak different languages, because it's exactly what you're saying. Like, why were they surprised that you were speaking Spanish, but no one's surprised if I speak English? right?
Yeah.
Like, why no more people learning to speak Spanish when they're from the US? I remember I recently heard something about people, I think it was on a TikTok or whatever. Someone was like, why would you want to teach your kids Spanish if none of the parents speak Spanish? And I was like, why not? And right, like they immediately see Spanish or any other language as unnecessary, right? It's not going to open doors for you as English might or as
Well, they
Chinese or
don't know the world they're missing because my
yes.
children, when we moved here from London, they didn't speak a word of Spanish. Now they speak like native speakers. They correct me all the time. But what they see when we go to the US and they walk the streets of New York and they hear Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Venezuelans and they can hear the different accents, they realize this world was there all the time, but it wasn't, the door was closed. But now the door is open and they realize there's this huge diversity of cultures in the Spanish-speaking world that's opened up, and now they want to learn everything. So
I love that.
That was the gift we gave them. And so I'm jealous of how fluent they are, because I will always speak well for a foreigner, but not like a native speaker. But I also think that it's going to help them in whatever they do.
It's going to open so many different doors in terms of creativity, like books they can read, movies they can watch, places they can travel. And I really hope, as you were saying, more people get to experience immigration in different places. And even if it's for a short period of time, I think you just having the opportunity to be an immigrant, having the privilege sometimes of being an immigrant can shape you and can change you forever. So, you know, whoever has the opportunity, I think they should take on the risk and the adventure.
Yes, and please come to Costa Rica sometime.
I actually have a cousin that lives there, so I keep wanting to go, and now I even have more people that I know there, so I'll reach out to you. Yes,
I would love that. And for your listeners as well, Costa Rica is a beautiful country and really worth a visit.
Yeah, I guess you can maybe leave us one thing that you're loving or that you're really enjoying or that you have learned from Costa Rica and the culture there that we would like to know. I know it's a hard one.
No, the thing that I'm learning is how much nature means to me that I didn't understand, and having perfect climate. And even though it's the rainy season now, there's sun every day in the morning. So it's never dark. It's not like Seattle.
Exactly.
But I think what I also have to give space for and understand is that people are so family oriented that they don't really reach out. And I've met foreigners here, including Latin Americans who've been here 30, 40 years, who've never been invited to a Costa Rican home. And that's not unfriendly. They're just very private. So you have to learn as a foreigner to have a lot of space to understand a different way of looking at the world. And so I think, you know, it's always every day. It stretches you.
And kind of like leaving that judgment outside of the door. I really like that you're saying that, because coming into a different culture, we're immediately gonna judge, right? Like, oh, this is different from what I used to do, and we put like this negative label on it. But I really like that you're inviting us to say, hey, this is just a different way to do things, and see it in that way, and try to understand it, and see how we do things differently that other people might not understand, right? Or might see as negative. So that's really
exactly. Yes. And
that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Where can we find the book? I will leave the link.
Oh, yes.
I want to put the link.
It's called Our Mothers Ourselves, and it's available on my favorite independent bookstores in Portland, Oregon, and it's called Powell's. It's on Powell's.com. You were?
I was in Portland, and I love bookstores, so I need to go back.
It's my favorite place. It's also available on Amazon, but I always talk about Powell's or independent bookstores as well. And the stories are really different. There's one in Japan. One of my friends wrote about her mother, in Indian mother, immigrating to the UK. So there's a lot there.
It's beautiful. And I love books that can have like different short stories, short or long. Like I like those books that keep you kind of entertained. Awesome. Thank you so much, Veena. This was such an amazing pleasure. I had such a good time.
All right then.